We're continuing our study of Exodus and starting in chapter 21 with the laws that followed after the Ten Commandments. And the detailed instructions that we're going to see are essentially the application of the Ten Commandments in light of ancient Near East culture and for the purpose of taking it up a notch, because God is not in the habit of suddenly yanking people as a group into line with his ideals, but slowly bringing us from where we are to where we should be, because the journey is as important as the destination. And I've always used the story of people pulling a heavy cart up a hill, and they stop to rest now and then by putting a block under one of the wheels. The purpose of the block is not to pull the cart, but to keep it from rolling back down the hill. And likewise, God's laws and interventions were to keep Israel from regressing as a group. And we can see here in chapter 21, the first 6 verses are about Hebrew servants. The Greek word there is paida, which is what we get pediatrics from, meaning a child or youth, and sometimes used interchangeably with servant, more like a domestic, not a doulos, which is an outright slave. Though the context doesn't make really a clear distinction between the two meanings, the main point is that these were fellow Hebrews, and they must not be enslaved or employed, or however you want to put it, for life, unless by the servant's consent with the legal sanction of judges. So compared to slavery in the surrounding nations, this was very humane and protected the rights of servants or slaves as human beings. Hebrews were thus treated as indentured servants, more commonly for the purpose of paying a debt. And in this we see that the laws of Moses did not simply mimic existing laws from other cultures, but improved them. And we have to remember that Israel did not form in a social vacuum. Of course, there's going to be similarities with prior laws, with earlier civilizations. These things grew over time. That doesn't mean that the Bible borrowed. That's just the worst logic, a terrible argument to make on any text. Not just because it's the Bible, but because logic is logic, and if you know anything about history, it gradually unfolds, and people are always borrowing from what has gone before. That's just how it works. So now down in verse 7, we see immediately that there's an inferior status of female servants, in line with the fact that all females were considered inferior in being or essence, that is to say, their nature or intrinsically, in ancient Near East culture. A woman was always the property of some male relative or spouse, and she could be bought and sold even if not a slave, and she had no choice in the matter if her father decided to sell her as a concubine or a servant or whatever. Even so, she had to be treated kindly and given adequate provisions for living, and this was an improvement compared to other cultures. Remember this when people today whine about backlash against patriarchy or male entitlement or whatever they want to call it. There's the term white privilege, white male privilege. 2 wrongs don't make a right. Okay, but all human beings should treat each other as equal in rights and opportunities and basic human respect, not equality of outcome or disregard of ability or character, but equality of humanity. There's a huge gap between God's natural order and people's natural order. People tend to be, just as we saw God predict in the Garden of Eden after sin, that this was all cursed and people are going to be mistreating each other. And that especially was the warning to Eve, that if she followed Adam out of the garden, then he would rule over her. And that's what happened, and that's what we see. That is not what God intended. And then down in verse 12, the topic is homicide, manslaughter, and if it was accidental, the offending party could run to one of what were called cities of refuge for a certain time. I think, if I recall, it's another passage in Scripture that it said that it's until the person who had a grievance against them died, or something like that. So the deceased person's family couldn't just avenge themselves on an accidental death. If it was intentional, there was to be no refuge anywhere, not even at God's altar. And in contrast, the Code of Hammurabi, which came earlier, and everybody says this is the real thing that the Bible took from, it allowed capital punishment even if the death was purely an accident. So the Bible is improving and refining and restoring what should be. So we also see that if a child deliberately kills or even insults their parents, that child was to be put to death by law, though there doesn't seem to be any evidence that this was actually carried out. It was pretty much left to the discretion of the parents. And the point seems to be that this was a last resort for a habit of assault against parents or insult, just defying them on a regular basis, and not what the critics say of just a flippant attitude against children over everyday arguments. That's not what this was. That's what they take from it because it's a shallow reading that they do, and they look for any excuse, any molehill to turn into a mountain in critiquing the Bible. But the point is, and this is backed up by all the ancient Near East customs, was that you only did this if the child had this habit. So now we'll go down to verse 17. And it's very briefly mentioning about kidnapping, which was a capital offense and was to be carried out without mercy. There was no ifs, ands, or buts, no fine print, no gray area or conditions. If you were guilty of kidnapping, you were put to death. And then after this, the text turns right away to a case where two men are fighting and one is injured. It's basically an early form of workers' compensation, if you read it, because the injured party must be compensated for the loss of employment and medical expenses. But if the injured party is their own servant, they're only punished if the servant dies. The reason is that the servant is the owner's property, so the owner is already punished by loss of services, and no further legal penalty is imposed. The reason death is worthy of punishment is, again, because life belongs to God and can never be owned by us, but only leased. So that's why if the servant didn't die, that there was no payment due, because that servant obviously wasn't working for the master anymore, and so they were already losing something. So it was in the master's best interest not to mistreat their servants. But again, life is a bigger issue to God. Even with a servant, it's not your life to take, so your life would be demanded. Of course, to our modern Western ears, this all seems barbaric, but remember that God is only putting a block behind the wheel, so to speak, and setting minimal standards in light of human frailty. Even Jesus mentioned in the New Testament that later when we read about the divorce laws, that the Pharisees were trying to get him to take sides in a dispute of theirs, and he said that God only allowed the writing of a certificate of divorce because of men's, in that case, hard hearts. God makes concessions. This is not his natural order, it's a concession. But so he's setting these minimal standards, and it was a step, not the whole staircase. That's what we have to remember. We're taking steps, not leaping from one story to the next. Jesus is the top of that staircase, of course, but even in the New Testament, we see the teaching of a gradual change after the cross, after ascension, in the epistles, so as not to cause chaos in society. However, too many have dragged their feet and clung to what God intended to be superseded, such as flesh-based entitlement, slavery in all forms, etc., gender inequality, not because, again, of outcome, but because of permissions not granted because of one's flesh. That shouldn't be. We should have moved on beyond things like that a long time ago. And then down in verse 22, we see that there are cases where if two men are fighting and a pregnant woman nearby is injured and the baby miscarries. And this is where we first see the principle an eye for an eye. Since there was no premeditated intent to harm the unborn child, the punishment is to fit the degree of injury. It seems to indicate that if the child appears fully formed and would have otherwise been born alive, the one causing the baby's death must pay with their own life. Constable's notes, again referenced in the description, include an argument against the claim of abortion advocates that this passage treats the baby as not a person. So check that out if you'd like to see the scriptural support. There's a bunch of verses there showing how the Bible overall treats the unborn and values them as human beings. So this cannot be used as a proof text for abortion. Regarding permanent damage to various body parts of an owner's servant, then in that section, the servant is to be set free as compensation. So if a an owner maims their servant in some way, such as causing them to lose an eye or a tooth, and that servant was automatically granted freedom as compensation. Because after all, that servant would have a tougher time working for someone else if they had to do so. And then down to verse 28, the next topic is harm against humans by animals. Whereas the Code of Hammurabi demanded the death of a man's son if his ox killed another man's son, these laws of Moses demand the death of the man, not his son, but only if he was habitually allowing his ox or bull or whatever it is to run free and cause damage, if that was a habit. If not, then only the animal has to die and it cannot be eaten. Even so, if the man is to die, he can offer to pay a ransom for his life, but if the person killed by the animal was a child, no ransom can be substituted. If the victim was a servant, even a female one, the animal's owner has to pay the full price of a servant, that being 30 pieces of silver, the amount we all know that Judas was offered to betray Jesus. In other words, they were only valuing Jesus on the level of a common servant. So that's where that comes from. And then down in verse 33 is the case of someone failing to take reasonable safety precautions for a pit they dug, and an animal falls in and dies. Basically, the pit owner has to abide by the modern saying, if you break it, you bought it. In the case of one animal killing another animal, the killer animal must be sold and the money divided, and the meat of the dead animal divided. But if the killer animal was known to be dangerous, the owner would have to pay the full price rather than half, so they couldn't split it and share the cost in that case. In all of this, so far, we can see that these laws show compassion for victims beyond other ancient Near East norms, including the Code of Hammurabi. And in some cases, the biblical laws are harsher because the value God places on human life is higher. So this is an improvement by any stretch. And all of this is to teach people to respect other people and their property, and to even value servants, slaves, women, animals. All of them were to be treated humanely. And people should be compensated or penalized, as the case may be, according to the particular circumstances. So these are not barbaric laws at all. And then in chapter 22, this section goes on to the issue of theft, and the penalty involved compensation beyond the value of the stolen goods as a punishment and a deterrent. If the thief is caught in the act and dies at the owner's hands, the owner is not held guilty unless it was daytime, because it's presumed that during the day you would see this person coming and know whether or not they intended to take your life. You wouldn't know that at night in the dark. So, and if the thief can't pay the penalty on top of what they stole, the thief has to be sold as a slave. That's just compensation. Actually, one of my ancestors suffered the deaths of her husband and baby on the way to the U.S. on the boat, and she was sold as a slave when she got to the U.S. to compensate the ship's captain for the trip. That's just how it was, and everybody thought it was reasonable, and this was not something that was just made up in the U.S. It was not something the Bible made up as far as that was out of line with anything else or barbaric or anything like that. The ship captain needed compensation, and slavery, again, wasn't what it turned into in the U.S. as just being vicious to people. And there are people today who are vicious to animals, and they should be locked up too. But the point being that these are reasonable laws. And then down in verse 5, the next section concerns a careless animal owner whose livestock is grazing on someone else's land. So they're not really doing terrible damage to a person or to another animal, but they're taking somebody else's livelihood. And the demand of suitable compensation also in this section for things like arson, where you've done some careless burning and it's spread to somebody's stack of grain or whatever it was, and how to deal with that. Then it also deals with a person who is negligent in safeguarding what someone else entrusted to them, and cases where the person was actually robbed rather than negligent. So if you were put in trust of taking care of somebody's property and you were robbed, then that's a different case than if you were just careless. And then down in verse 9, we can see that there's some more mundane issues, various issues covered, and then we'll go up to verse 15. For all of those, I'll just let you read through those. And then down to 16 is where it turns to the issues of morality, which still carry property compensation penalties. So this was not a religious practice, it was just a moral, ethical issue that deserved compensation. And it says here that if a man seduces an unbetrothed virgin, that is to say she's not owned by anyone or promised to anyone but her father, he, the seducer, has to pay the bride price and marry her. And if not, he can pay whatever the father demands, but it's up to the father to set that price. So this was another deterrent, and don't try to take what doesn't belong to you. There's 3 other issues mentioned briefly after that. The no questions asked execution of sorcerers, of those committing bestiality, and those sacrificing to any god but the real God. The Greek word for sorcerer is pharmakous, which means someone who administers potions for the purpose of inducing visions or hallucinations. And the Bible doesn't care if the intent or it's black or white magic, so to speak. This is not just the dispensing of any and all potions for medicinal purposes. The modern word pharmacy is derived from this word, but it has changed its meaning to dispensing medications for healing, and the Bible clearly allows the use of medicinal compounds. Too many careless would-be theologians jump to the wild conclusion that all modern medicine is forbidden by God because they don't consider how the Bible uses words, and that those words change meaning over time in between languages and cultures. So just because we use the word pharmacy doesn't mean that we're doing something the Bible forbids, because the Bible's meaning in its context, all of them considered, is that a pharmakous was giving out potions for use in magic or other religious rituals to alter the mind or whatever it was. And that's what God is forbidding here, not healing. Okay, now we go down to verse 20. And we see that this is, actually verse 21, that should be about hospitality, because 20 was already mentioned in the previous section about people who sacrificed other gods. So now in verse 21, it turns to the issue of hospitality with the reminder that the people of Israel were once foreigners in Egypt. God makes it clear that he himself will administer severe penalties to those who oppress foreigners, as he did to the Egyptians on behalf of Israel. So they would be hypocrites, not to mention punished because of it, if they mistreated foreigners, since they themselves were foreigners who were mistreated in Egypt. But then in verse 25, it deals with the issue of what is commonly called usury, which some mistakenly apply to all forms of charging interest on a loan. But this text is talking about money borrowed by the poor. The poor are borrowing out of necessity, and for that reason they must not be charged any interest. Money borrowed by the better off as a business investment is not in view here at all, though in other scriptures interest was not to be charged to a fellow Hebrew. In any case, no matter how rich they were, you didn't charge interest to a fellow Hebrew, but you could charge it to foreigners. Of course, things like extortion or loan sharking, things like that are clearly forbidden in all the scriptures without regard to whether or not the borrowers are Hebrews. But even the permission to charge loan interest to foreigners is held in contempt by modern Western critics as an excuse to hate all Jews without distinction or exception. All I can say is that such people should be held to the same standards of guilt without a trial. And Jesus mentioned this in the New Testament. He says, whatever standard you use to judge others will be used to judge you. So if people want to blame an entire race of people or religion, they are both, the Jews are, then they themselves should be sharing the blame with their whatever group of people they're from. That's all I'll say about that. And then down in verse 28, we see this final section that we're going to cover in this lesson is about first fruits. You all should be familiar with that term. And we've already learned why God reserves the firstborn sons for himself, but now it also includes the first and best of herds and crops. to remind them that everything belongs to God and we're just leasing it. That's what first fruits is about, giving God what belongs to him, not just because he wants to skim off the top of someone else's labor, but because it was already his to begin with. So that's what first fruits is about, and we'll learn more about that in actual religious rite or festival day where the priests actually did a wave offering or sheaf offering where they would start off the feast of first fruits. And then tacked on to the end of the chapter is the command for people not to eat the meat of an animal that they themselves did not kill, but to leave it instead for the dogs. The rationale presumed by most commentators is that since the time and cause of death is unknown, this meat would pose a risk of disease, and the blood had not been properly drained. Blood had to be drained from an animal before it could be eaten. And so this is just at the very least a safety issue. If you find a dead animal, you don't know how long it's been there necessarily. You don't know what conditions it died under, whether it was disease, sickness, malnutrition, or being, you could tell, I guess, by looking at it if it was torn apart by another animal. But again, you don't know the condition of that other animal either. So the best way to deal with that is to take the conservative safe side and not eat it and leave it for scavenger animals. So we will continue with chapter 23 next time, and these will be more civil laws, mostly it looks like between people. So we'll stop here for today.